Imam al-Ghazali talks a little bit about the science of ilm al-kalam, or the science of speculative theology. And he said that it is unlike the other sciences, the other disciplines, namely fiqh, jurisprudence, and tafsir, and hadith, and all of the other Islamic sciences. And he says fiqh and hadith and tafsir, they're like nutrition. You can never get too much of them. You can always study them. And they're good for the believer, for the Muslim. They'll never be harmful. But he said that ilm al-kalam, which was more of a historical development than something that happened in the early period, is more like medicine. When Muslims were expanding and the borders of Islam were expanding beyond the Arabian Peninsula, many other different types of people came into the deen, and they included in this area of the world Anatolia and what was formerly Byzantium, including North Africa, including the Indian subcontinent, and many of them had prior religions. They were either Zoroastrians, or they were Christians, or they were Jews, and they had also revealed books that they read, and they also had their own sects, and they also had their own disputations. And so the ulama of Ahl Sunnah found that to suffice themselves with what the scholars of the early period said, such as Malik wa Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Sufyan al-Thawri, and others, where they would read the Quran, and in those particular areas where the meanings were ambiguous, they would say, we read them as they came and we understand them without delving into particular interpretations of those verses. But they found that this didn't suffice with people who were coming into the religion. And they had to take a different approach to talking about these verses in the Quran, as well as many issues in Islam that are similar to theological issues that were with the people who came into the deen. And so the science, or the discipline of ilm al-kalam, was developed, whereas they can offer logical, rational arguments for things such as the existence of God and the necessary nature of the existence of God, and for the nature of sending of the prophets and why they were sent, why the prophets were sent, and these things. And so that developed as a whole science. And much of it also developed and came out of the discipline of logic that was inherited from the Greek system. And there have been differences of opinion regarding the permissibility of studying this type of ilm al-kalam. And what we should be basically aware of is that the ilm al-kalam, or the theology that many of us study now, is actually doesn't really resemble what Imam al-Ghazali is talking about in the Ihya. What we study now is more of a very creedal type of theology, where it's very basic, where we have a set of creed to memorize and to understand, and then very basic rudimentary arguments about understanding the attributes and the existence of God and so forth. What Imam al-Ghazali is talking about is something far more complex and difficult to grasp. But nevertheless, he said it had a purpose, and it continues to have a purpose, in that it's a type of discipline that's considered as a treatment, a medicine for a particular time, a particular place, and particular people. And he said that not everyone should delve into this type of speculative theology. And he mentioned 3 major attributes for someone who was going to do so. And he said first is that it had to be someone who's fully dedicated to learning the discipline, and someone who had full time to do so. At-tafarrugh wa at-takhassus. So they have the full dedication, at the same time they delve into it wholeheartedly, because it's not the type of discipline that you can read a little bit of and then go and run with it. And then he said also such a person would have to be highly intelligent. It's not for people who have difficulty with things that are even less difficult than the science of ilm al-kalam or speculative theology. And finally, he said they should be people of diyana, people of taqwa, people who are pious, and that they need to know how to use it in the proper way at the proper time. So after Ghazali mentions all of that, and it's a long few pages about ilm al-kalam and speculative theology, he gets back to the main issue that he's concerned with this particular chapter, and that's namely ma'rifah, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says the key to ma'rifah is mujahada, and defeating the lower appetites. So struggling And Ghazali's path was a path of mujahada. It was a path based upon staying up at night, and a path of hunger, and a path of offering the night vigil, the night prayer, and a path of prescribed isolation from people at certain times. In other words, for a way for the shahawat or for the lower appetites to be overcome and to be defeated. And also to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-iqbal ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to actually continually seek Him and to not lose sight of that. So when Ghazali talks about ma'rifah, and he says that the way that it can be earned is not so much by reading about creed and reading about disputation, but it's something that Allah sends and puts in the hearts, he then goes into his discussion about ظواهر العلوم وأسرار العلوم, the outward sciences and the inward sciences, the outward disciplines and the inward disciplines. And he uses a hadith that was narrated on the Prophet ﷺ. It's Sahih Ibn Hibban. It's narrated, إِنَّ لِلْقُرْآنِ ظَاهِرًا وَبَاطِنًا وَحَدًّا وَمَطْلَعًا. The Qur'an has an outward aspect, it has an inward aspect, it has a definitive aspect, and it has a point of departure. And many of us, when we read the Qur'an, we have some glimpse of this. And the Qur'an is the book that when you read it, you never tire of reading it. And when you go back to it, you find things in it you didn't find the first time. And when you go to the second and third time, you still find new things. And in fact, those who continue to read the Qur'an will always find things in it that they didn't find the time before, because Allah is giving that person those things. He's receiving inspiration. And one of the best ways to really know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially after one has been able to rid themselves of some of their lower appetites, is by reading the Qur'an. And the Qur'an should be everyone's aspiration. The Qur'an should be the thing that you read so much, it occupies your thoughts. You reflect upon its verses. And especially this is encouraged during the month of Ramadan, as we're approaching the month of Ramadan itself. It's a time to prepare oneself to really re-establish, if you don't have a solid relationship with the Qur'an, or to continue that relationship with the Qur'an, but intensify it during the month of Ramadan. And it was the way of the Salihin and the righteous people and the pious people before us that they dedicated themselves entirely to the Qur'an during Ramadan. In fact, anything else that they were reading during that time, they would suspend for the month of Ramadan to fully concentrate upon the month of Ramadan. And most of the Islamic seminaries, in fact, would be on hiatus during the month of Ramadan, because it was seen as that month of reflection and that month of really contemplating the meanings of the verses of the Qur'an and reading the Qur'an with tadabbur, contemplation and reflection. So he said there is an outward and there is an aspect. And he also mentions that the Prophet ﷺ said to the Sahaba, لو تعلمون ما أعلم لضحكتم قليلا ولا بكيتم كثيرا. If you knew what I knew, then you would laugh less and weep much more. And the Prophet ﷺ did not elaborate on what that was exactly, what he knew. But what the hadith indicates is that he knew something that even the Sahaba, who were the most elevated people in rank after him, ﷺ, they themselves did not know. And if it was something that was not in the outward science of the Qur'an or the hadith, then it's something that's specific to the Prophet ﷺ, an inward type of science. Ghazali also quotes at Tustari, where he says that the scholar has three types of knowledge. The first is an outward type of knowledge that he teaches to the people, which includes tafsir, hadith, Arabic language, mustalah al-hadith, the science of hadith, ilm al-rijal, things that are dealing with the outward sciences. Then he has a second type of knowledge, which is an inward type of knowledge that he could not teach to or disseminate to except to those people who could understand that type of knowledge. So not to everyone. It's not for all people. He said, لِأَهْلِهِ. So the ahl of something are the people who are of that type of knowledge, those who can reflect upon it and can use it. In other words, if that type of knowledge was to be transmitted to people who could not really reflect upon it, it would be a fitna for them. And it's narrated, this khabar goes back to Ibn Mas'ud, that you cannot mention something or teach something to people that they cannot understand except it becomes a trial for them, a tribulation, a fitna. And so the scholar has to keep this in mind and has to keep in mind the people that he's teaching and whether they are at a stage where they can accept and understand that which he is trying to teach them, that which he is trying to convey to them. And then lastly, the third type of knowledge, he says it's a type of knowledge that is between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that he should tell no one about. Something very specific to him. And these are like tajalliyat. These are like things that Allah makes manifest to the believer. He gives them understandings of the unseen and of the divine realm that can't be understood via the outward disciplines, but nevertheless, these are spiritual gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give to some. And so that type of knowledge, if it were to be disseminated, if it were to be talked about, it becomes a fitna. It becomes a trial for many. And we see that some of the ulama actually did go ahead and do that. They actually did talk about some of these spiritual insights that they received. And it did become a great fitna for many people. Because when you're talking about things of the divine, the language itself will struggle to express that. And they have a saying, al-ibaratu jafa', that the ibara, the phraseology that's used to try to express such things that are beyond expressionable, if one doesn't understand the code of the language that's being used to understand it, then it becomes a fitna for them, and they can understand that which is not intended. And so there were some people who accused Shaykh al-Akbar Ibn al-Arabi of doing that, of talking about types of knowledge that people couldn't understand, and in types of phraseology that was very enigmatic and difficult to understand. And the ulama tell us that the books of Ibn al-Arabi are for the people who can understand Ibn al-Arabi, not for everyone. And in fact, he actually wrote those books in that manner so that it was meant for specific people and not for everyone to understand. And people like al-Ghazali and others, they tell us that we should at least have istislam. We acknowledge the maqam, the rank of people like Ibn al-Arabi and even al-Tustari and Ibn Sab'in and others. But at the same time, if we don't have the faculty, we don't have the adawat, we don't have the tools by which we can understand their books, then we should refrain from reading their books until which time we do have them, or if we never have them, we can still grow quite much in our deen and reach high ranks without reading the books such as Ibn al-Arabi. And for those who can, and those who have a teacher, and those who can grasp what Ibn al-Arabi is trying to say, then they are free to do so. And so this sort of understanding that people are different in their levels of understanding and in their ability to adapt and to interpret text is something that's acknowledged in the deen. There are ranks, there is tafawut. Even in paradise, there will be different levels for different people. People's knowledge of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world is going to vary from one person to the next. And so the deen acknowledges that. Even Imam Malik himself, he said that there are 13 types of knowledge, of discipline that I learned in my lifetime, and I told no one about them. لَمْ أَبُثُّهُ لَأَحَدٍ. I did not disseminate them to anybody. So even the mujtahid imams who are associated with the outward disciplines, the outward sciences, such as Imam Malik and Imam al-Shafi'i and Abu Hanifa and Ahmad ibn Hanbal and others, they themselves had a type of inward understanding that they knew should not be disseminated to people because it's only meant for certain people, and perhaps it's not meant for anyone. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses for you and you keep it to yourself. Then Imam al-Ghazali, he talks about that what is the reason that some of the inward understandings are not understood by everyone or are not meant for everybody. If there's so much benefit in them and they are really a way to ma'rifah, then why can't everyone avail themselves of that type of knowledge? And he mentioned several reasons. The first is that they could be quite precise and difficult to understand to begin with. That the nature of what's being spoken about requires someone who's well versed in the discipline and very intelligent, and not everyone has the ability to do so. And we're exhorted to speak to people in language they can understand. خاطب الناس على قدر عقولهم. Speak to the people at a level that's commensurate with that they can understand, in a manner they can understand, in a language they understand. And that's one of the cornerstones of da'wah, of speaking to people about the deen, is that you have to put it in a way, in a manner that they can understand. And so that particular way of some of our ulama is not going to be understandable for everybody. And there are going to be particular secrets and pearls and jewels within our Islamic disciplines that are not readily understood by everybody. The second reason, he said, is that it can be harmful to some people. It could be a fitna, trial, as we mentioned, for some people and not others. And he compared this to the sun rays, the light of the sun during the day is harmful to bats. And the bats can see at night better than they can see during the day. But nevertheless, because of the brightness of the sun, it's too much for the bat to handle, so it doesn't venture out during the day. And if it were to do so, it could become blinded. So, because of the radiance of the sun, it is a trial and tribulation for the bat, much in the same way that the radiance of some of these disciplines is difficult for people to understand. It would be a fitna for them. And he also says that some of these disciplines, some of the knowledge that is learned by people, can be mentioned in a way that is easy to understand and adapt, and only later on, after they reflect upon it and after they've tasted some of those meanings, then it becomes more apparent and more clear. And such is ma'rifah. So the descriptions, for example, of paradise and of hellfire that is mentioned hadith, Ghazali compares this to if you see someone from afar and it's a dark night, it's not a moonlit night, and they're behind some type of curtain, you can make out a shape, you can make out a form, and you sort of understand that there's a person there. But you don't have immediate and precise knowledge of what that is exactly. And so when we understand the creed, such is our knowledge in the beginning. We have a basic understanding, but dhawq, or a type of immediate knowledge of this, such as we really see it as it is something that can be brought about by a study of the inward sciences that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give you as He pleases. And so if the person comes from behind the veil and then the daylight shows upon him and the sun rays come through, then at that point it's more clear than it was before. And so many of our awliya have seen these type of visions, have received this type of knowledge, where knowledge of the unseen becomes more clear to them based upon their reflection upon it and based upon Allah giving them tawfiq. And so that doesn't happen for everyone. It's not apparent for everyone. And then finally he says some of the verses, if understood in a literal form, would not be understandable. And sometimes it's more of an eloquence of the state of something than the tongue of something. And he uses the example, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. And there is nothing, and he says the words nothing, that except that it hymns the praises of God, except that it makes tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so someone who was to take that literally, they would start thinking and say, well, how does the mountain praise God? Does it have an ability to speak? Does it have a tongue? Does it have fingers and a sibha that it can count on? Things like that. But what's meant in the verse is lisan al-hal, that the hal, right, the state of the mountain, the state of the river, the state of the ocean, the state of the whale, the state of all the creatures on earth have a way of making tasbih. And that's why the verse ends, وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. But you do not understand, right? It's unintelligible to you, their types of tasbih, how it's making tasbih. But not for everyone. Some people do understand how they are making tasbih. And for people such as the Prophet ﷺ, he would actually, in an almost physical sense, hear it, because he would walk through and walk by rocks and they would give salam back to the Prophet ﷺ, inanimate things, trees and rocks and things of that sort. So he had complete and precise understanding of how this tasbih was made, of how these inanimate objects were praising the hymns of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah can give this to people, right? And it could be unclear in the beginning and then it becomes clear later on.